All right, so you guys are getting pretty close to the AP exam. I mean, when I say that, I mean, like, we're within what, 6 or 7 weeks? What? How are we doing, Hirsch? I'm not even sure off the top of my head how many weeks you've got. I know that it's not very long. You guys hopefully have been doing a lot of maybe. Hello, it messed up my name. It's Ava. Oh, I see. I see that now. I wasn't sure what you meant by your comment, Ava, but I see what you mean. Awesome. So hopefully you guys have been doing a little bit of you're getting pretty far in the course. Maybe your teacher's been doing some drills, or maybe you're getting ready for a mock test. I think there's no better way to prepare for the test than to answer a bunch of multiple choice questions, study vocabulary, and practice FRQ. So really just I wanted to start off real quick just with some quick ideas about how to go about doing this. I know that a lot of teachers put some of their Kahoots, make it very public. Very generic stuff. I mean, you're not going to find anything super mind-blowing there, but you do find some good practice and some good application for some of the AP Human Geography concepts. So if you want some extra practice, go to Kahoot. I know that there's a teacher that does like a mass Kahoot you might have been told about from your teacher. Do you have any suggestions on books to study for AP tests? Yes, absolutely. One of them, I don't have it with me right now. I'll put it in the comments real quick. My favorite is, and many human geography favorites, human geography teachers, excuse me, their favorites is the AMSCO book. You can get that on Amazon. It's a little bit more pricey than the others. The only thing I say with reservation on the AMSCO book is that you do not get the test key. When you get that, you get a bunch of practice questions, but you don't actually get the key for it. Your teacher would have to order that for you, and it will be sent to them through the school. If your teacher has the AMSCO book, chances are they already have the key, in which case that's my #1 suggestion. Ethel Wood is the author of another good one. All right, and it's very similar to AMSCO. I would get one or the other. No need for both. Very, very good books. Again, the Ethel Wood book comes with a key that's not really attached to the student version of the book. The one that I think would be the best bang for the buck, if your teacher doesn't have any of these books, is the Cracking the AP Human Geography exam. And that is by Princeton Review. And another one is the Kaplan is the publisher for another good one. So all 4 of those right there are really good. Here's the thing: do you need to go and get all of those? No, because #1, you're here. You've got 5 more. What we're gonna do, first of all, last week we spent a little bit of time looking at development indicators. Really good stuff for how we measure development. And one of the last things we did was we talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary economic activities and how those things go into how we measure what development is based on how much the percentage of those different economic activities are being done. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take that to the next level and look at what is core countries, what is periphery, what's the spatial distribution of these things. We're going to look at Wallerstein's world systems theory, Rostow's model of economic development, and we're going to look at how self-sufficiency and international trade as an approach to becoming a developed country fit into this big old puzzle. So just to kind of recap some of what we looked at last week, the 3 basic types of jobs, all right, or labor is primary, secondary, tertiary. Now, you can break down tertiary into quaternary and quaternary as well. And we talked about how quaternary is your knowledge sector. So teachers, professors, doctors, people that have a high levels of education. And then quaternary would be your CEOs, your politicians, any of these people with decisions that affect millions of people. Primary, though, is agriculture. Secondary is manufacturing. We haven't talked a lot about manufacturing yet. We're going to, like I said, I think next week is when we start that. But the reason why I'm saying this is because when you look at at your core regions today, you're really basing it off of the countries that are the richest. And we already discussed that countries with a high number of people working in the service economy have enough money to buy the services. Now remember, services are things you can't hold and touch. They're haircuts. They're people serving you at a table when you go out to eat. It's me giving you a review. You can't hold this review in your hand, but you can use this review to get ahead on your AP test. And so it's a service. And you have to have money in order to buy these services. And most services are not going to save you in a zombie apocalypse. And what I mean by that is they're not totally necessary. They're things that we can buy because we have the money in richer countries. So we looked last week at some of these maps here. This right here shows air traffic from country to country. This right here shows the GDP per capita, and it's a cartogram. There are huge spatial implications regarding development, as we've already seen. All right, so most airplanes are going between North America and Europe. Overwhelmingly, Europe is a huge destination and a huge place where people are going to leave from via airplane traffic. Your richest countries on Earth, according to the cartogram, is going to be the United States, Europe collectively, the European Union, and so on and so forth. So it gets you thinking. When you look at something like this, or when you look at something like this, or HDI maps that show which countries have the highest human development index, you tend to see a trend where if you're north of the equator, you're pretty much one of the richest countries on Earth. And if you're south of the equator, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, and really Australia and New Zealand, then you're usually what we're going to consider the periphery, or a poor country. Now, that is not a very PC way of referring to the differences between developed and developing, all right? Because it gives, again, it kind of implies that certain geographies make one place better than another, and so we want to hesitate from saying the Anglo-European countries of North America and Europe are going to be better than other countries. But there is this peculiar spatial a pattern where you kind of can draw a line here, separating the developed countries from the developing countries. And this line, I meant to put it in my presentation and I didn't. This line is actually called, the Brandt Line. I didn't put my captions on. The Brandt Line. Hopefully there it goes. That's exactly how you spell it. The Brandt Line. All right, and it is a geographic line that really kind of separates the developed north from developed south. So sometimes you will see the terminology global north or global south. Again, most geographers, I would say, probably stay clear of words like that because it has a certain connotation that if you're talking about the global north, everyone knows you're talking about the most developed countries on Earth. If you're talking about global south, then it's implied that it's maybe not as developed and therefore maybe not as good. I'm not sure if y'all had a chance to read the article that I posted in last week's Google Slides, but the one that talks about how people measure development, I guess, local level, it's really worth going in and reading. So these maps indicate that there is a geographic trend to development. We've already looked at it, so no crap, right? So why aren't other countries developed? And if poor countries get rich, do rich countries get poorer? All right. So in other words, I guess people think that if maybe if rich countries or if poor countries today start to get rich, that would detract from the wealth of richer countries, right? And sometimes we might think about things like resources, and we might think, well, if everyone, there's a John Green world history crash course on globalization, one of his last world history videos, where he talks about if every one of the 7 billion people on Earth were driving cars, then we wouldn't be able to drive cars in the way that we do. And so when people think about resources and how not everyone can live their life with the kind of resources that we have in the United States, or we run out real fast, we kind of think that, well, if everyone else had access to these things, then we would then have to limit our own use and therefore be poorer than we are. Well, you forget about innovations and progress and science and technology that kind of, if we have a need to innovate, we tend to find ways to do it. Now, that's more of an optimistic approach, but most people are going to say that if a rich country is rich, they don't have to get poor in order for poor countries to get rich too. So we've got 2 basic ways of looking at this. And one of them is dependency, and just maybe should say dependency theory, all right, as opposed to dependency model. And then there's also the modernization theory. So looking at dependency theory, it suggests that rich, powerful countries more or less keep poor countries poor. Now, if you go back and you look at imperialism, and if you, back when we were doing unit 4 with political geography, we looked at imperialism a little bit. Some of y'all may have had world history or may remember it from 7th or 8th grade. But imperialism is a period where some of your most industrialized countries of Europe and North America start looking for markets and resources that they can use to build up their own industries and their own wealth. And so imperialism is quite literally countries going in and taking advantage and exploiting other countries for their resources and their labor. All right, and also then they would go back and try to sell their manufactured goods to these poor countries, and in some cases even try to impose their culture on them, like the British did with India. So we tend to think about let's see, the well-being of the richest countries come at the expense of the poorest countries, and we saw this during the age of exploration and imperialism. But today, it's not outright imperialism. Sometimes you might see the word neocolonialism or something like that implies that the rich countries still kind of in some way, usually economically, control the fate of the poorer countries. But when you look at dependency theory today, we're looking at development, right? I guess for the sake of what we're talking about here. So when countries during the Industrial Revolution and imperialism, when they were developing, all right, so we're talking about Europe, the United States, pretty much, the rules of engagement were different. What I mean by that is that the United States used slavery. Europeans and the United States used they had no regulations on pollution. There was no real city planning. Things were just nasty. Houses were too cramped together and were fire hazards, and the poorest people had terrible working conditions. And we were able to, I guess, build up ourselves economically, basically just by winging industrialization. Okay. Also, during imperialism, we used military force sometimes as a means to exploit countries for their resources. And so today, none of these things happen. And so, it almost looks like the rules that we used to modernize to become more developed today isn't the same as what would have been during the original, I guess, core countries industrialization period during the Industrial Revolution. So Wallerstein has this world systems theory or world systems model that kind of goes along with dependency model. Here's how it looks. Okay, and this is going to make sense once I explain it to you. But you've got three different, I guess, geographic regions, and you can look at this at different scales. Right now, we're going to look at a global scale. But you've got core, you've got semi-periphery, and periphery. Now, if you look at core, just by definition, core is the center of something. So the core of the earth is at the very center of the earth. The core focus of a meeting or of a class lecture is going to be whatever that topic is. Well, the periphery then is going to be whatever's on the outside. All right. So core and periphery are inherently going to be opposites by definition. Semi-periphery then is going to be a little bit on the outside, maybe a little bit closer to the core, but not quite the periphery. So when you look at how the relationship between these different geographic regions looks like this, all right? The core regions, they let's see, high profit consumption of goods, all right? So they sell a lot of goods to be consumed to countries in the periphery and the semi-periphery, and in return, they get cheap labor and raw materials from periphery and semi-periphery. And notice that semi-periphery kind of maybe gives a little bit and also gets a little bit, depending on which region you're looking at. They're right in the middle. Another graphic looks like this. All right. So your core is going to send goods out to the periphery and semi-periphery, and they're going to be receiving resources, usually raw materials of some sort that can be manufactured into something that can then be sold to other countries. So you can kind of see this connection. And we've already looked at this in agriculture with luxury crops such as coffee, which is grown in some of your poorest countries on earth along the equator, but then manufactured and sold to people in the developed world. Excuse me. So the world system theory kind of implies that there is this relationship that exists between rich and poor countries. And in a way, because that relationship already exists, it's really easy for it to continue to exist at the expense of some of your poorer countries. Might be a good way of looking at it, might not be, but I know yesterday a big news story broke where you've got all these rich celebrities paying to get their kids in some of the most prestigious colleges, which they're using their wealth to do this, right? Rather than their kids' natural ability, or I guess God-given smarts and hard work and their sports. So these people are paying their kids' way in the college, and it's really, really shady stuff. And it's really insulting to people who have worked really, really hard to get to those colleges. So in the same way that rich people there can continue to use their wealth to get their own way, and we already know that happens, it's kind of like that when you look at the world systems theory. According to the people who are proponents of this theory, the richest countries already have what it takes to be rich, so it's easier for them to hold on to that, more or less. And it comes at the expense of some of your peripheral regions. So this map here does not, I don't like this map because I don't know if I would consider these countries, you can't see my mouse cursor, I don't know if I consider all these countries to be straight up periphery. I definitely wouldn't. But the ones that are labeled as semi-periphery, they are more or less semi-periphery countries. You also might would have some semi-periphery countries in Southern Europe, and maybe some of these would be semi-periphery countries as well. Definitely the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is not periphery. It's definitely semi-periphery. So maybe I should have used a better map. Basically, Emanuel Wallerstein is the person who comes up with this world systems theory map. Sometimes you'll see it called Core-Periphery model. And he proposed that the world system theory, it looks like this. Unlike the term developed and developing, the Core-Periphery model does not imply that change will occur. It implies the way things are already. There is a center point, an economic core is what we're looking at. So, and sometimes political core as well, but definitely in this case, economic core. So the world economy is going to be centered on more or less Europe, the United States, Japan, Korea, maybe China, India, because they're big, and a few others. The core-periphery regionalism got its start during the period of colonialism. All right, with an industrial revolution comes a need for resources and markets. So colonialism, and was reinforced by the industrial revolution and continues into the age of globalization, which is we're talking about today. So. And here's your core, another way of looking at it. North America, Europe, they're the primary core region. I know this map is old, but it hasn't changed that much because we're looking at the core measured by the same countries that were the first to up during the Industrial Revolution, more or less. MDCs, or core, is going to be your MDCs, the countries with the most wealth and the strongest economies, the economic center point of the world. Also, since they have most of the wealth, they have the largest market for luxury goods. All right, so in other words, people they can afford to buy things that might be more expensive for the developing world. They also consume the most energy per capita. All right, so here is a map that shows the countries that per person, right, or per capita within the country are using the most energy. The United States, people per capita in the U.S. use far more energy than just about anywhere else in the world. Other places that use a lot of energy include most of Europe, Russia, China is up there. You got to think there is over 1 billion more people in China than there is here in the U.S. And so they're not using as much per person, but as a country, they use more than the United States. Saudi Arabia is a huge petroleum or crude oil producing country, and they use oil like I mean, it's like candy over there, right? It's really their one economic activity, and by golly, they're going to use the heck out of it. And so they're high consumers of energy per capita as well. But once again, you can kind of pretend that Brandt line is here and draw a line that separates the most developed countries based on the use of energy from the ones that are the poorest, and they'll look pretty much like the map we saw at the beginning of this presentation. So I just mentioned to you earlier that you can look at the core-periphery model at different scales. Now, remember, when we talk about different scales, you got global scale, you got regional scale, continental, state level, local, citywide. Geography is all about the spatial perspective. And in order to understand how things are laid out, in order to understand the why and where, you have to understand the scale of what you're looking at. So when we look at the European core, it's going to be basically everything in this circle here. Okay, Germany, I've said before, is the single most economically productive country in the European Union. So if you break it down and you're not looking at just the EU, but you're looking at country by country, Germany has the strongest economy. The United Kingdom is basically anything in this circle here is going to have a high service sector, and the types of industries they produce are going to be very high-end industries. All right, things similar to what we might produce in the U.S. Then even like, Barcelona is in Catalan. Catalan is an extremely wealthy autonomous region within Spain, and they do pretty well. They'd be considered part of the core. Western and southern Spain would not. Southern Italy would not. Northern Italy would. right? So, I mean, this circle, it looks almost too pretty to be true, but the circle does a really good job at basically circling the core region of Europe. And so your peripheral regions would be like southern, you can't see it's because like that menu keeps getting in the way, but southern Spain, southern Italy, Greece, Turkey even, maybe parts of Eastern Europe. All right, those would be your peripheral regions. If you're looking at just the European core as a core periphery. Okay. Here is another map that illustrates that. Notice that Southern Europe is not part of the darkest colors because it would be more of a semi-periphery within Europe itself. So I mentioned that I don't have another image, but we can even break it down more than this. I didn't think about doing this at the time that I made a presentation, but if you wanted to look at in the United States, we've talked about during population, you've got your megalopolis region from Boston to Washington, D.C. That would be the economic core of the United States. Or of that region, New York City would be the economic core. Or if you're looking at just New York City, maybe Manhattan would be the economic core. So you can definitely break down the idea of core and periphery at the different regional and local scales and really use it to understand the spatial perspective. That's one thing I wanted to point out since I didn't have a slide for that. Now, dependency theory, there are criticisms to it. Foreign aid actually is shown to help countries and poorer countries to develop, not hurt them. So when you think about things such as dependency theory, it's the idea that richer countries are going to keep the poor countries as poor as possible. Well, over time, the poorest countries have still become less poor, even though you could argue that with globalization, the difference between the richest and the poorest have maybe increased. So there's still a silver lining with that, but for the most part, foreign aid tends to be a helpful thing. Overall, people are better off today than they were a century ago. I just said that. Only factors in economic influences, not cultural influences by countries like the United States. So what I mean by that is sometimes you can think about the United States culture as being an imposition to the cultures of other countries. Like, for example, in many places in the Middle East, they might think that the United States pop cultural values is kind of a damper on their own culture. And so when you're looking at dependency theory, it doesn't take into consideration things like that, but mainly just economic influences. And also, it tends to kind of be a little bit outdated. All right. So I've got written here, not about industrial revolution anymore, and international trade has shown that some poor countries can achieve higher levels of development. Now, we're going to look at international trade very last in this presentation, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. But you guys may have heard about or learned about the Asian tigers in your class with your teacher, so we're gonna break that down at the end. The other side of the coin here is going to be modernization theory, which is the idea that wealth can occur for any country. And this kind of began with the Industrial Revolution. So the best way of understanding the modernization theory is by looking at Walter Rostow's stages of economic growth. All right, and so really this is called his model of economic development. All right, so it has basically 5 different stages that, based on his observations and based on history, he says every country goes through these basic steps on their path to development. And here is the way it looks. You start off with a traditional society. That's exactly what it sounds like. You've got people are using subsistence farming. They're doing trade with, like, I'll give you my corn in exchange for your sheep. They're doing bartering. And the economy is almost entirely based on some form of agriculture. And so when you think about traditional societies, the things I start to think about is like your ancient civilizations, or maybe even before that with hunter-gatherer societies, right? There really isn't a country that is going to be in your stage 1 today. Now, there might be groups of people living within certain countries, like your African Bushmen, or like certain groups living in the Amazon rainforests that are going to be considered part of your traditional society, but there are no countries in that stage. Stage 2 is your transitional stage. So you start to move from being a traditional society into the next phase. And it's going to look like this. You start seeing more specialization of labor. You start seeing surpluses of food. Maybe people live a little bit longer and populations tend to go up a little bit. And over time, they start building up better infrastructure, right? So you think about a transitional stage, they're going to be maybe some of the poorest countries of today, like some of your sub-Saharan African countries. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds just like the demographic transition model. And honestly, I'm not going to say it doesn't. It is very similar in concept to the demographic transition. The main difference, though, is that whereas the demographic transition model that we learned about in Unit 2 is talking about population growth, this is all about economic development. But as we already know, the population changes that occur during the model occur because different levels of development begin to occur. So the two models, I think, can correlate pretty well, but just know that the main difference is that the demographic transition is population, and this right here shows economic development. All right, so the next stage, stage 3. This is where you start to see industrialization. So Europe and the United States, they started stage 3 during the Industrial Revolution. Today, countries that are going to be in this stage are going to be those that have a large secondary secondary activities like industrialization. So they're starting to move away from agriculture and produce more stuff. So they start to see urbanization. People start moving to cities looking for these jobs, and they start producing stuff, usually basic industries, like maybe producing shirts or producing something that might be a part of the technologies that we consume, but not the whole thing. Eventually, better success, maybe less kids, lead to more people having a little bit of money in their pockets. They start being able to buy some services, and that's when you start to see the drive to maturity. All right, so you start to see a lot more diversification in terms of what they're able to produce. Maybe some degree of services are available. You start to see more innovation. You start to see more work efficiency, a little bit more technology, a little bit more investment from foreign countries, and also from companies within that country that continue to lead that country to higher levels of development. And then finally, once you get to stage 5, you're living it high on the hog. You're like the United States or South Korea or Japan. Okay, so very, very high level of development. We call this the high mass consumption. People have the money to consume things that may not be necessary for their life, such as certain types of goods, certain types of luxury foods. Everybody gets to drive a car. In fact, it's weird if you don't have multiple cars in the United States. It's weird if you don't have a TV in every single room. Things like this for stage 5. That kind of makes sense. I mean, I feel like this model, as long as you look at the images here in the chart, the model seems to make sense to me. I think it's pretty straightforward. And here's a bigger. I should have had this up. I didn't realize I may have a bigger version of it. But that's the Rostow the Rostow model of development. Now, the biggest, according to people that are proponents of this model, the biggest hindrance of economic development is going to be the lack of willingness of people on a local level to adapt, according to the modernization theory. So what I mean here is that if a country isn't changing from one level to another, like for example, if a country doesn't make it out of the transitional stage into the takeoff, it's mainly because of certain types of traditions or things that they might have in place at the country level that prevent them from being able to take off. And so when you look at this model and you say, well, this is exactly what happened in Europe. This is how the Europeans industrialized. And then you say that comment I just made, that cultural traditions might be the reason why people don't. And it almost looks like the only people that can ever become developed countries are those that follow the European Western style. And so this model here takes a lot of flack because it implies that the way to be developed is to be like the West, which really isn't entirely true, because culture can still be unique and development still be had by poorer countries. All right, so critics say this model only applies to the West. There are outside forces, in addition, that cause development disparities that are not related to culture and traditions of poorer countries. For example, there might be governments that are corrupt. There might be unequal access to resources or unequal control of resources within a certain country. There might be other countries that prevent countries from doing certain economic activities that may enable them to grow and become more developed. So there's all sorts of outside influences that are not necessarily accounted for in Rostow's model of development. All right, even more criticisms. And I think most of these come from the Amskill book, but the model relies on the exploitation which occurred during the Western countries' development according to the model. So it's kind of like what I mentioned earlier when you have different rules of engagement. This model occurred and was worked well for the Europeans and for North America during a time when they had different rules and regulations on basically everything. There's also this idea that linear change is not always the case. Today, you might not see countries go from one stage to another in a seamless little ladder style model. You might see changes from the transitional stage to take off and drive the maturity simultaneously. And because today is 2019, and there's other forces that might help or hinder development. And so it's not accurate to say that it's going to look like this every single time. It might be a little different from country to country. Also, critics are going to imply that all countries can develop, but there is still so much variation between countries in terms of size, population, topography, and resources. So to be clear, the modernization model, as we already discussed, I believe I mentioned this in here, wealth can occur for any country. So it is a liberal model. It is a model where everyone says every country can be wealthy and can develop. But even when you look at that, you got to take into account that some countries have better access to resources. Some countries have better terrain and have higher populations and bigger markets. So these things definitely do play into what countries are able to produce economically. And then you've also got the fact that it doesn't address sustainable development. We'll talk more about that later. So kind of wrapping it up, and to be honest, I say wrapping it up, I've still got a little bit more to go. We're probably not going to go a full hour today. That's okay. But what we're looking at here is there's two different models, or I guess paths to development that are mentioned in the Rubenstein book. And I wanted to take a moment to address those because I think it kind of plays into what we're looking at with dependency and modernization. And that is the self-sufficiency and international trade approach to development. And these are two basic ways that countries have more recently tackled the path to development in modern times. And so don't forget, today countries follow different rules than we mentioned earlier. So when you look at self-sufficiency, India, China, they may have tried to some extent to follow this path. Larger countries are going to have more access to resources. And so it makes more sense that larger countries like India, for example, which is the case study mentioned in the Rubenstein book, they might be, I guess, more successful at a self-sufficiency model than a country like Japan, which basically has no resources and has to rely on international trade. So here's a map that is really, really grainy, terrible map. But the reason I'm showing it to you is because it goes to show you that some of the largest countries, let's face it, if you have a ton of territory, the odds are pretty high you're going to have a lot more resources in that territory than a tiny country, right? So it makes sense that these countries here might be those that try internet, I guess, self-sufficiency. The more territory that is controlled, the better the odds of their resources. Also, countries following the self-sufficiency model try to restrict cheaper imports from other countries with things like tariffs. And so India has done this. Recently in the United States, you have seen where we've imposed tariffs on certain foreign goods in order to stimulate economic growth, I guess, in industries in the United States. It really is very similar to the same idea as what we're looking at here. The United States can do that because we're able to produce some of these goods because we have access to a lot of resources and things. But if we were a smaller country, we would still have to remain dependent on these other countries for getting access to those goods. Also, in the case of India, government policies restrict foreign trade. So in the cases of countries that follow a self-sufficiency approach, they may have restrictions that just, I guess, they decide at government level how much of something a country is going to be able to sell in their country. All right, India actually had so their currency couldn't be converted into other currencies in order to really kind of inhibit countries from doing, I guess, Indian businesses from doing business with countries outside of India. So the idea of self-sufficiency is Indians produce goods for Indians to consume, and India benefits from it. All right. In order to do that, you have to have a lot of resources and pretty decent labor pool and pretty decent market. So what happens when you don't have a good market and companies produce stuff and it doesn't get sold. I'm so sorry about my children, y'all. I hope that's not too much of a distraction. Also, in the case of India, I guess what I was just now saying is that if companies don't do so well, the government might be led to give subsidies to those individual countries. So when I talk about a subsidy, this is a word that I would write down for you. A subsidy is like an incentive, or it's like a payback, or maybe a tax break on a country, on a different company, that allows them to produce something even at a loss. So if these countries, I'm sorry, I keep saying countries, if these companies are selling to people within India, and they're not selling to other countries on the outside, the government might reward them by giving them subsidies in order to make up for what they're not making in terms of profits. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that kind of sounds like bad efficiency, and that's one of the criticisms of the self-sufficiency model. So this leads to large bureaucracies, all right, and in a lot of cases, even government corruption, because it might be easier, as Rubenstein says, for people to find workarounds around government policies rather than try to find solutions to how to do business through them. It also limits competition and leads to inefficient practices. So, if you want a company to totally suck, make it where there's just one and the government backs it up, and there's no incentive for that company to make better products or to promote the well-being of its people. If you add a lot of competition, everyone's got to be on their A game, or else they lose business. And so those are some of the problems. The other side of the coin here is international trade. And what this does is it allows countries to develop based on their comparative advantages. Now, this is an economics term. So if you've ever taken economics, you know what this is. If you haven't taken economics, the concept in its most simple form is that some countries are good at producing certain things. They should produce those things. And other countries are better at producing different products, and the two should trade the two. Okay? So I like to give this example here. If I did CrossFit for several years. If I was a CrossFitter, and I'm not a very big guy. I was pretty strong for my size, but I'm not super strong. So if I'm going to do a workout that involves climbing a rope and doing deadlifts with 275 pounds, I can, believe it or not, deadlift 275 pounds, but I can't do it very much and I can't do it very fast. But if I got 350-pound big Gus doing this workout with me, then we're going to divide it up based on comparative advantage. I can climb the rope really fast. He can lift the weight really fast. So I'll do all the rope climbing and he will do all the heavy lifting. And that right there is comparative advantage. Now, to make that make sense in this model here, what we're looking at is you've got your Asian tigers or dragons or little dragons or some other Asian stereotype. And the way it works here is that countries like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, even before the age of tigers, it was like Japan, for example. These countries are really, really high developed countries today based on the Human Development Index. They're economic powerhouses, but man, they ain't got no resources. They have no resources. They live on mountains and rocks. They don't have any agriculture. They have no natural resources like oil or natural gas or any of that stuff. So how in the world is Hong Kong ranked number 7 in the world in 2018 on the Human Development Index? And Singapore is ranked number 9, and South Korea is ranked number 22 with a 0.903. For a point of reference, the United States Human Development Index is 0.924. Remember last week we said that the Human Development Index is between 0 and 1. The closer you are to 1, the more developed you are. The closer to 0, the worse off you are. Taiwan is not recognized as a UN member and is still very, very far up there. By the way, Hong Kong and Taiwan both are technically part of China. It really depends on who you ask, but China is definitely going to claim them, and I guess according to policy, can take them whenever they want to, as long as nobody stops them. But these are all going to be very small countries or city-states. So Hong Kong and Singapore are basically city-states or micro-states. South Korea is a very small country in the Korean Peninsula. Taiwan is very, very small. And none of these countries have any resources. So how in the world do they get high levels of development? Simply, they achieve development by using their comparative advantages. And so they import what they need in order to live, and they specialize in exporting things that they are very good at producing. And it might look like this. Taiwan's top 5 commodity exports, I'm not sure what year this is, but it's basically going to be the same, is they're going to export refined petroleum. That is like processed oil. That's their biggest by billions and billions and billions of dollars. That's their biggest thing. They're gonna send out flat rolled stainless steel, things that might be used for making buildings or wherever it might be. Different types of metals like silver and copper that might be used in some kind of electrical construction or whatever. I mean, I'm not super expert on all the different uses of these goods, but this is their comparative advantage. This is what they're primarily using to achieve high levels of development. In exchange, they import crude petroleum. Well, that makes sense. If they're going to refine the petroleum and sell it, they're going to have a lot of that stuff. They also import refined petroleum. So you might be thinking, well, why are they going to import refined petroleum if they also export it? Well, the United States does the same thing. We produce a lot of our own oil, and we do export that oil to some other people. We also are the single most oil importing country on earth. So we almost produce, I think we almost produce what we import. And so it's kind of neck and neck, but we make it and we also import it. If you look at this right here is Singapore. I don't have it labeled, sorry. But Singapore, you've got their top 10 exports right here, their top 10 imports right here. Okay. And if you look, you got electrical machinery, equipment, things that might go into making computers or some types of industrial computers or even iPhones or things like this. And there's a lot of that. You might also have precious metals and certain types of organic chemicals, plastics, perfumes, aircraft and spacecraft components, or things that might be sold to the United States so they can make Boeing airplanes. Maybe hold your horses, maybe not. I don't know if you guys watch the news. And last but not least, this is South Korea. I didn't put up. There's one. Which one did I do? The other. Which one did I miss? Hong Kong. I didn't do Hong Kong, but South Korea looks like this. Refined petroleum is their biggest export. Again, cars are a huge export. Integrated circuits, things that they use. Integrated circuits are they use it for electrical components and things like this. Again, I'm not a super expert on these things. Hyundai is a Korean car manufacturer. Samsung is their single largest company in Korea. If Samsung takes a big hit like they did with the Galaxy Note, the entire country's economy is actually affected by it. They make car parts, different types of broadcasting equipment, telephones. All these things are somewhat related, right? They also export their culture, especially regionally. But you guys have surely heard of K-pop, and if you haven't, all you gotta do is bring up Spotify and listen to Gangnam Style by whatever the guy's name is, can't remember the dude's name, but what's his name? Psy, right? And so that's K-pop. You guys are surely familiar with this. Go on YouTube and listen to K-pop. These guys export their culture as well. So in a sense, the way that they were able to achieve such high levels of development is by taking advantage of making the things and selling the things that they're really good at making. And then if they need it, they bring it in. They also, you can imagine, they import a huge amount of food because they don't have any agricultural capacity whatsoever. So they are dependent on international trade for development. Now, let's look at international trade problems, because it's not without its problems. Resources may be limited in the countries that rely on international trade. In particular, the resources they export might be limited. So if you look at countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, which they have a lot of the material that goes into making batteries for cell phones, or maybe even a better example would be Saudi Arabia. Their entire economy is centered on oil production. Well, if the demand for oil goes down like it has in recent years, then oil doesn't bring in as much revenue, and the entire economy could get burned by putting all their eggs in that one basket. So that's a really good example. Increased dependency on markets and MDCs. may lead to doing less for your own country's people. So in other words, if you're producing a good that you know is going to sell well to MDCs, you might spend all your time producing that one good, and then at the end of it all, you have to pay those same MDCs for their agriculture or for their crops to feed your people. And so you aren't able to invest that profit into your own development. So it kind of keeps countries where they are. Again, looking at that economic dependency model. And then finally, markets for goods may decline, like we just now were talking about with oil, except in this case, maybe if you're looking at basic manufacturers, especially if you're looking at making clothing or something like that, that might be sold to people in developed countries. Well, the only places on earth where the population isn't growing is places like the United States and Europe. And those are the markets for luxury goods. So if you're going all in and producing a good to be sold to European and American markets, and the population isn't growing, then eventually that market's going to decline, all right, and you're going to lose out. So those are all problems that countries have faced in the international trade model. So I know we have not gone an hour, and that's okay. You know, we still went a little further than I thought we were going to on this discussion, and we got a lot of good stuff in. These resources here they're all on YouTube. If you type in those topics in YouTube, it'll come right up. Theories of global stratification. She talks about modernization and dependency theory. Does a really good job at providing a summary on these topics. The APHUG geography video, the second one there on Wallerstein, is by Carolyn Bednarz, and it's a little bit on the long side, but she does a really good job at breaking down the world systems theory. And the next one is Dan Snyder's Models of Economic Development. He kind of summarizes more or less everything that I just talked about today, except for the stuff at the end with the international trade and the self-sufficiency model. So in summary, we talked about Wallerstein's model shows the spatial distribution of core and periphery countries based on development. Rostow's model of economic development shows a process by which countries go from developing to developed, but it's criticized for being too Western, among other things. And countries have used both self-sufficiency and international trade recently to improve their development. So that's it. That's all I got for you today. Like I said, next week, almost certain, you know, that we're looking at industrial revolution and modern industrial regions. So next week might be a little bit longer, and that's great. Think about any questions y'all might have for me, and you can ask me now if you haven't, or save them for next week. If there's questions you might have about how to study that you want to ask, write them down, make a note, and I'll be here next week at 7 o'clock to talk about those things with you. Any questions before I let you go? Well, I appreciate y'all's time, and tell your friends about me. You know, we're here every single Thursday night at 7 o'clock to 8, and we're doing human geography. Thank you very much.